The last time I was this excited for a Shonen Jump manga was
Never.
So when I was scrolling through my YouTube feed while taking the most lethal dump of my life, I came across this manga called Centuria. Now, I don't know about you, but when a series is a single word name, it automatically means it's gonna be a banger. Like you got Berserk, Vagabond, Kingdom, Monster, Usogui, Climber, Pluto, Real. Hey bro, what is it with these series that are just single word names? Plus the name Centuria just gives me a dark fantasy vibe. It sounds like the name of some foreign temple or city under the earth. So to me it was off to a good start before I even opened the first page. But then I opened the first page and... yeah, I got high hopes for this one. You've seen videos like this all over the place where people call a series the next Berserk or the next big shonen series, but most of the time you kind of just say, meh, it can't be that good, I probably won't end up reading it. So I won't beg you to read this manga, but I'll say this. It is only 8 fucking chapters. Not only does that mean it's an easy read, it speaks to the power this series has. To get my hopes up in such a short time span, and to not require 30 freaking chapters to start getting my hopes up and have me in anticipation of something great. In only 8 chapters, I am absolutely hooked. If that wasn't enough, this manga is written by the assistant of Tatsuki Fujimoto, the dude responsible for a little somewhat popular manga. The author doesn't seem like the type of dude who would want to levitate, but my god, I was levitating after that first chapter because it grabbed me by the balls and now has me waiting for the next chapter like it's One Piece. If I was to give you a summary, a real quick summary, I would say that this is the combination of Vinland Saga's themes with a Berserk-like world and the Grey Man powers, as I kind of see the inspiration from all of these works, and I'm glad I do because I love all of these works. The story begins as Vinland Saga Season 2 did with a bunch of slaves on a boat until a stowaway spawns and somehow doesn't get his balls chopped off. This stowaway is our protagonist Julian, and despite his looks, he appears to be a young child. Now this dude has been raised by quite literally nobody. In fact, he wasn't even fucking raised. He's never felt the warmth of a mother, never been given compassion, and is pretty lost as you can imagine. That is, until he meets Myra, a male mom who for the first time shows him compassion. Despite the situation all the slaves were in, the misery they had to endure, they treated each other as human beings despite being treated as cattle by the higher-ups. This was my first signal to being like, this might actually be a really good series. Not only is the first chapter longer than my attention span, but it really grasps you like many big dark fantasy series are able to do. In this case, the main theme introduced is the cruelty of the world, and the fantasy is brought in later in the chapter. The ability of a series to grasp you depends on the mood of the first chapter, because after all, us humans interpret things based on our first impressions. What a shonen dark fantasy should do is set the mood for the entire series with just the first chapter, or if it's a short first chapter, the first couple chapters. Like I said, we get a dark introduction to the type of world we're in, and it's not an immediate introduction to fantasy because we need to establish some of the characters, and once that's done, the fantasy element can walk in and shock the reader and grasp them into clicking the next chapter with intrigue. This is a lot like how a fellow dark fantasy shonen Attack on Titan does as well, and it's known for having one of the most riveting introductions in anime history. It introduces the cast and the premise of the world and draws you into the fantasy and the dark fantasy by introducing giant nudes and having Aaron's mother being eaten out in the first episode. It is a genius way to introduce the series, which is why I can attest to the potential of Centuria after just a couple of chapters. Now, for the fantasy element. There's different kinds of fantasy, especially in manga, being so diverse in its artwork. For example, you could have something like Chainsaw Man or AOT where the threats are recognized like titans or devils, and those are pretty much the only threats and the only real fantasy elements. Or you can have something like Berserk where yes, you can have apostles, but there's something super magical like talking trees, witches, fairies, and so on. That to me is true dark fantasy, kind of like Lord of the Rings, Song of Ice and Fire, and so on. Berserk has a vast array of fantastical characters, so there are no limits to what it can bring out, as opposed to the limited fantastical nature of a series like Attack on Titan or Chainsaw Man. Not to criticize those series because they do it perfectly for their own worlds. Centuria is more like the former, like Berserk. The first chapter we're introduced to a giant tentacle goddess who grants a wish to anyone willing to make a sacrifice of many souls and one important soul. This is our initial introduction to the fantasy element, And as I mentioned, this is not the only thing we see. There are a vast array of very unique monsters and creatures. So once this tentacle goddess arrives, we're at a point where Mira and Julian are pretty tight and there's no hope of them escaping the slave owner's ship. So it's a tough decision to make for both of them because one of them has to sacrifice their life to save the other one. And both being very close, they want to both be the sacrifice. I should also mention that everybody on the boat at this point has been murdered by the slave owner for insurance money, and Julian and Mira are the only ones remaining by complete coincidence. Once again, this brings up the dark theme of the world just before dropping the massive fantasy bomb of the giant tentacle goddess. Now, the tentacle goddess asks for many souls and a soul of great importance to the one who offers said soul. So of course it's going to be Julian who makes the sacrifice because he's got that main character power, and the important thing here is that he acquires the power through a heart-wrenching sequence with a ton of emotion. That sets up the goal of the protagonist, ignites intense emotion, and sets the theme of the world up beautifully. Let's compare it again with Attack on Titan's first episode. Eren's goals get set up, we are highly emotional, and the nature of the world and the vulnerability of its inhabitants is captured all in the first 20 minutes or the first chapter. And that's how in just one chapter, Centuria set itself apart from all the other Shonen Jump manga currently ongoing. I should also mention, though I can't go too deep into it or I'll risk spoiling, that the manga has a ton of freedom with its fantasy, and in the later chapters there are more doors that begin to open, and so my intrigue just continues to grow. There are many subtle questions that are built which make me think this fantasy world is so much more complex than the other ones, like this text mentioned by a tree
thing
saying to Julian that he invaded the forest because he's from the sea, setting up a territorial conflict and giving an air of historical conflict and even more mystery. This leads me into talking about the power system, which even until now is still one great big mystery. The only real fantasy element with the power system so far is the protagonist Julian, who sacrificed great value to get this power in the first chapter. Like I said, this power reminds me of Alan Walker from The Gray Man, and oddly enough, so does Julian's personality. He's somewhat passionate about helping others because he doesn't want them to feel the neglect that he did growing up, so he uses this power to help others as best as he can. The interesting thing about this power is not only that it grants him a ton of strength and speed, but it also grants him immortality for 100 deaths. Basically, this guy has 100 lives, so one can only wonder what will happen once he runs out. Again, mystery keeps you hooked. As for oppositions, it's hard to explain as they seem to just be like normal people, but there are some exceptions like this tree dude that Julian ends up fighting, who's able to manipulate his environment as he likes and kind of transform and use the trees around him. More fantastical elements, as I mentioned, a lot more freedom than some more restricted fantasy series. I predict based on the other fantasy series that I've seen that soon we're going to get introduced to a character who has also sacrificed something in order to get his powers, similar to Julian. Now, every good fantasy needs a protagonist that stands out from others, and so far Julian has done just that and more. What I'm most surprised about is how the author was able to throw in such deep themes like humanity and attachment so early on without making it feel out of place or premature. Julian already has mystery built up behind his past, and already his experiences have driven him to pick up a purpose and a passion in helping others, which can lead his character down a very dark path, fitting for the world this story is set in. I find a ton of potential in this character, and the cherry on top is how fucking cool his power-up looks. The neglected, abandoned character is a common trope, yet in Centuria it feels different with the theme of slavery being added. The surrounding cast hasn't done much to show for, but you can't expect that after 8 chapters. The contrast between the fantastic elements like Hydra Dogs and 100 Lives, contrasted with the humanity Julian is trying to find and spread to the people around him, is just beautiful. And we best be grateful that this manga is in Shonen Jump because it's as seinen as I've ever seen a series be. Julian's progression will be a unique one, and the big antagonist, whoever it might be, can definitely play the role of that motherfucker who just wants everyone dead because the world is just cruel. It has been a very long time since I've found a shonen manga, a Shonen Jump manga that has had me this excited, and a lot of the time I tend not to catch up to a lot of the popular Shonen Jump manga, but you best believe that Centuria will be on my list of manga to remain caught up to. There is no way I'm going to fall behind on this manga, especially when it's still so unknown. Centuria is a certified banger and you have no reason not to check it out. Just like that subscribe button, you should definitely give it a shot. Get caught up while it's still unknown because this shit is going to blow up.